Gracias a todos por conectarse con nosotros. En breves momentos estaremos iniciando con esta conferencia virtual con el profesor Louis Nelson de la Universidad de Virginia. Estamos dejando unas instrucciones en la cajita de comentarios para los interesados en escuchar la traducción simultánea en español. Pueden ir al botón en la barra de abajo que dice interpretación y seleccionar el canal de español. Y ahí entonces escucharán la intervención del profesor Louis Nelson en español. Los que se sientan cómodos escuchando la intervención del profesor Nelson en inglés y escuchar a los demás interlocutores en español, pueden dejar cotejado el que dice off o apagado. Y si usted selecciona uno de los dos canales, el de inglés o el de español, debe de por favor cotejar donde dice silenciar audio original, para entonces no escuchar en el fondo el murmullo, ¿no? de quien está hablando en su idioma original. Entonces, veo que siguen entrando participantes. Bienvenidos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Veo que Carlos Andújar, el director general de museos del Ministerio de Cultura, hace su entrada. Muchas gracias, Carlos, por acompañarnos. Muy contenta de tu gentileza, de agradarnos con tu presencia. Entonces, damos unos minutos, veo que siguen entrando participantes a la sala de conferencias, entonces en unos minutos, breves minutos, estaremos iniciando. Vuelvo y les indico que pueden utilizar el botón de interpretación para poder elegir el canal que deseen, tanto en inglés o en español. Si se sienten cómodos o si saben, o sea, si saben inglés y español, pueden dejar cotejado off y entonces oirán las intervenciones en los idiomas originales. Si elige uno de los canales, debe de cotejar silenciar o idioma original. Así que bueno. Saludos, Olga Rodríguez, directora del Departamento de Relaciones Institucionales Internacionales de la Universidad OIM. Gracias por acompañarnos. Muy bien. Bueno, pues vamos a dar inicio. Bienvenidos a esta conferencia virtual. Mi nombre es Irene González. Soy especialista de proyectos estratégicos de la Embajada de los Estados Unidos y durante esta mañana estaré con ustedes moderando este evento. Les comento que para esta conferencia virtual, la Embajada de los Estados Unidos en Santo Domingo colabora con el programa de ICS, la variable patrimonial, de la Facultad de Arquitectura y Artes de la Universidad Central del Este, auspiciando la participación del arquitecto estadounidense Louis Nelson, quien dictará la conferencia Patrimonio Arquitectónico Estadounidense, Sostenibilidad y Valor Social, el caso de la Universidad de Virginia, primera universidad reconocida como Patrimonio Mundial por la UNESCO. Quisiéramos distinguir la presencia de los representantes de la Universidad Central del Este, la señora Francis Peguero, directora del Departamento de Desarrollo Académico, y Francesco Garavina, director de la Escuela de Arquitectura y de Artes de la Universidad Central del Este. En representación de la Embajada de los Estados Unidos, contamos con la presencia del señor Luc Stelle, agregado cultural. Pero antes de empezar, quisiéramos hacerle algunas recomendaciones técnicas. Esta conferencia tiene disponible la traducción simultánea al español. Para acceder a esta, puedes seleccionar en la barra inferior de la pantalla el icono que dice Interpretación. Elija el canal en español y así puede cotejar. Y también, o sea, si elige el canal español, puede cotejar, silenciar el idioma original para no escuchar el fondo, la conferencia en inglés. Recordarles que durante la conferencia podrán ir formulando las preguntas y dejarlas en la caja de comentarios. Al final de la conferencia, el profesor Nelson tendrá oportunidad de responder sus preguntas. Continuando con los anuncios técnicos, les informamos que durante esta conferencia virtual no se responderá a preguntas sobre visa o casos consulares. Asimismo, al final de la conferencia, agradeceríamos que nos regalara unos minutos de su tiempo para completar un formulario de evaluación de esta conferencia virtual. Más adelante se pondrá en el chat box un enlace a este formulario de evaluación. Y para empezar con nuestro programa de hoy, doy la bienvenida al arquitecto Francisco Gravina, director de la Escuela de Arquitectura y Urbanismo de la Universidad Central del Este, quien hará una breve introducción a este programa. Adelante, Francesco.
Muy buenos días a todos. De manera particular, gracias Irene por darme la palabra, y tengo que decirlo claramente, todo eso pudo darse gracias a la labor que tuvimos realizando en las anteriores semanas con Irene, para que efectivamente el proyecto, este viaje virtual alrededor del mundo a través de este medio que es el patrimonio, pudiese transformarse en realidad. Era muy importante para mí tener la participación de la Universidad de Virginia. Después le diré, también le desvelaré la anécdota en este sentido. Un saludo particular, por supuesto, a nuestro invitado especial, Luis Nelson, el profesor Luis Nelson. Good morning, Luis. Muchas gracias. Thank you for your acceptation for the conference. Gracias también a Luc Stelle, que es el agregado cultural de la Embajada de Estados Unidos de República Dominicana, y por supuesto también a la licenciada Francis Peguero, la responsable, la directora del Departamento de Desarrollo Profesoral Académico aquí en la Universidad Central del Este, y al equipo técnico que nos soporta, y por último a todos los que han aceptado, que están con nosotros hoy en esta actividad. La actividad se enmarca, como ha dicho correctamente Irene, en un programa que denominamos X, la variable patrimonial, y el acrónimo X está para itinerarios, cuadernos y seminarios de arquitectura. Y la idea es la búsqueda efectivamente de una valoración y rescate de los legados patrimoniales de los distintos países alrededor del mundo. Y esta es la que vamos hoy a escuchar, en la cuarta conferencia. Iniciamos en enero con los anfitriones de República Dominicana. Estuvieron con nosotros la doctora Virginia Flores Sasso, el doctor Esteban Prieto, que presentaron las catedrales de República Dominicana. Y en una segunda etapa de nuestro viaje tuvimos la oportunidad de estar con el doctor Mustafa Kalay de Marruecos, y nos presentó la Medina de Fez, para llegar en la tercera etapa de nuestro recorrido. Yo me río un poquitico porque efectivamente casi me he montado en este avión patrimonial, y la tercera etapa tuvimos la oportunidad de visitar Madrid, gracias a la anfitriona, la doctora Carmen Hidalgo, que nos presentó el patrimonio industrial de la ciudad de Madrid. ¿Por qué en este caso pensamos de hacer una visita a Estados Unidos y entonces tener la oportunidad de compartir con Luis Nelson, porque me llamó la atención en una ocasión, lo digo tranquilamente, en una ocasión cuando estaba haciendo una investigación sobre el patrimonio de las universidades, el hecho que la Universidad de Virginia había sido la primera universidad reconocida como el patrimonio mundial por la UNESCO, a pesar de ser italiano, entonces de tener siempre mucho aprecio, obviamente, por mis raíces. Encontré como algo extraño, es raro que la institución académica efectivamente nace, se considera que nace en Bolonia alrededor del 12º siglo. Entonces, me pareció que efectivamente podíamos tener tanto patrimonio cultural nosotros también en Italia. Y haciendo la investigación descubrí muchas cosas que, por supuesto, no voy a desvelar porque si no, Luis después en separata sede virtualmente me podría matar. Y entonces, dicho todo eso, agradezco nuevamente la presencia de todos ustedes y de Luis. Sé que será una excelente experiencia para que podamos nuevamente valorar, conocer el valor social del patrimonio cultural, la salvaguardia del mismo patrimonio. Quizás Nelson podrá ayudarnos también a entender el compromiso de los Estados Unidos en la valoración y salvaguardia de la herencia patrimonial. Y, por supuesto, nos gustaría en algún momento conocer también la visión de la Universidad de Virginia de los Estados Unidos hacia la dimensión del interés, de la responsabilidad en la promoción y la salvaguardia, efectivamente, del mismo patrimonio que ella posee y que es reconocido por la UNESCO. Muchísimas gracias. Me despido ahora y estaré con ustedes más tarde.
Muchísimas gracias, Francesco, por tus palabras y ahora le cedemos la palabra a la señora Francis Peguero de la Universidad UCE.
Muy buenos días, ya han dicho mi nombre, de la Universidad Central del Este y en nombre de nuestro rector, el licenciado José Jacín Torres, le damos la más cordial bienvenida a todos los participantes de este evento. Agradecemos especialmente a la Embajada de los Estados Unidos en su persona de Irene y en la representación del señor Luke Schelt. Lo dije bien, ¿verdad? Y también agradecemos a la Organización de Ciudades de Patrimonio Mundial por su colaboración y muy especial agradecimiento al doctor Luis Nelson por ser nuestro conferencista del día de hoy. Esperamos que este evento siga enriqueciendo los valores culturales de la sociedad, de nuestros estudiantes, pero que sobre todo este proyecto de itinerarios, cuadernos y seminarios de patrimonio cultural siga rindiendo los frutos esperados. Estamos sumamente orgullosos de los esfuerzos que está haciendo nuestra Facultad de Arquitectura y Artes y lo seguimos apoyando y esperamos que disfruten el evento. Un placer.
Muchísimas gracias, señora Peguero, por sus palabras. Y ahora escucharemos las palabras del señor Luke Schelt, agregado cultural de la Embajada de los Estados Unidos, quien nos contará sobre la hoja de vida de nuestro conferencista, el profesor Luis Nelson.
Hola, buenos días. Es un placer darles la bienvenida a todos y todas a esta conferencia virtual dentro del marco del proyecto ICS, la variable patrimonial, programa de la Facultad de Arquitectura y Artes de la Universidad Central del Este. Agradecemos a la Universidad Central del Este, en la persona del director de la Escuela de Arquitectura, Francesco Gravina, por darnos la oportunidad de incluir la experiencia de los Estados Unidos en la preservación patrimonial y cultural en esta serie de encuentros. Nos complace colaborar en esta conferencia virtual auspiciando la participación del arquitecto estadounidense Luis Nelson, académico y profesor de la Universidad de Virginia en los Estados Unidos y experto en patrimonio arquitectónico. Pero antes de continuar con la presentación del profesor Nelson, me gustaría comentarles que históricamente Estados Unidos ha realizado grandes esfuerzos por preservar su patrimonio cultural como forma de mantener vivo el legado de su pueblo. De igual forma, el gobierno estadounidense muestra su respeto a otras culturas al apoyar iniciativas en otros países que ayuden a preservar su patrimonio cultural. En ese sentido, este año se cumple el 20º aniversario del Fondo de Embajadores para la Preservación Cultural, AFCP por sus siglas en inglés, fondo creado por el Congreso de los Estados Unidos con el fin de apoyar la conservación de sitios, objetos y formas de expresión culturales tradicionales en más de 120 países alrededor del mundo. Al crear estos fondos, el Congreso indicó que con esfuerzos de ayuda para conservar el patrimonio de otras culturas, mostramos nuestro respeto por ellas. Quiero dejarles saber que actualmente la convocatoria para recibir notas conceptuales para proyectos de preservación cultural está abierta hasta el 5 de octubre. Estamos dejando la información en la caja de conversación por si les ofrece obtener más información sobre este programa. Retomando la presentación de nuestro invitado de hoy, como les comencé a contar, el profesor Luis Nielsen es vicerrector de investigación académica y profesor de Historia de la Arquitectura de la Universidad de Virginia en los Estados Unidos. Es especialista en entornos construidos en el mundo atlántico moderno, con trabajos publicados y premiados sobre el sur colonial de Estados Unidos, el Caribe y África Occidental. El profesor Nielsen se destaca como defensor de la reconstrucción de la historia pública basada en lugares. La enseñanza e investigación del profesor Nielsen se centra en el examen detenido de la evidencia, tanto material como textual, como un medio para cuestionar las formas en que la arquitectura da forma a la experiencia humana. El profesor Nielsen tiene un doctorado y una maestría del Delaware University, y su licenciatura la recibió del College of William and Mary en Virginia. Esperando que esta conferencia sea de provecho para todos ustedes, les dejo con nuestro invitado para que dé inicio a su presentación. Luego de su presentación, tendremos un espacio de preguntas y respuestas. Pueden ir formulando las preguntas y dejarlas en la caja de comentarios. Espero que tengan un excelente día. Profesor Nielsen, adelante, por favor.
Thank you so much. It is such an incredible honor to receive such a warm welcome. Thank you especially to Irene and Francesco, the embassy and the university, for organizing and hosting this event. I am very excited to walk through some of the content that I've prepared for you today and look forward to our opportunity for questions and answers near the end of our time. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And there we are. Excellent. Can I just get a confirmation that you all can see my screen just fine? Yes, great. Irene, yes. Thank you so much for the head nod. Excellent. Well, let's go ahead and begin. I was asked to think about and present a little bit about what you refer to as cultural patrimony, historic preservation, and architectural history, asking questions sort of why and how, and then also to begin to apply some of those questions around why and how to my particular university, the University of Virginia. And so we'll spend some time in the second half of our time together focusing on thinking about ways that we have worked to preserve and interpret the University of Virginia, and also to expand our respect for the various peoples who are represented here. I'd like to begin actually with three little vignettes. Vignettes that might help us understand a bit more about why it is in fact that I think that architectural history and is important for communities and cultures to preserve. So our first story unfolds in 1943. In the middle of the German Blitzkrieg, the bombing of major cities across England, you may or may not know that one of those bombs hit the House of Commons right on the Thames in the summer of 1943. That particular hit, and you can see the ruins of the House of Commons in that one photograph there on the right. The destruction of the House of Commons in 1943 inaugurated a robust conversation amongst political leaders in England around the opportunity that that destruction might have for the remaking of the House of Commons. Now, the House of Commons had historically been, for centuries, always oppositional in its organization. And you can see the restored view of the House of Commons there below. And that means that half of the representatives sat on one side of the House of Commons, and the other half sat on the other side. And most frequently, these represented the progressives versus the conservatives, which generated robust argument and heated debate. And that heated debate came to characterize the process of political discussion in England in the House of Commons. The destruction of that space inaugurated a conversation around an opportunity to change that arrangement. And so some legislators actually wished to rebuild that interior, not in its historic form, but actually to reimagine it as an amphitheater or something more aligned with a legislature in the round, which might help to bring the two sides of debate closer together by using the space as a way of mediating against the oppositional nature of the House of Commons. The great man Winston Churchill, whose austere portrait you see on the left, weighed in very heavily on this decision. And he strongly argued against the reconstruction of the House of Commons in a new form. He wanted to preserve the vigorous debate and the heated arguments, which he felt were essential for successful governance in the House of Commons. And in the midst of that debate, he came out with this incredibly important and long-standing line, this quote. He says, "We shape our buildings, and afterwards, our buildings shape us." And so even at the level of the national stage and the unfolding of political discourse, Winston Churchill understood and argued that the preservation of building forms meant that national performances, rituals, and modes of governance were shaped by the buildings that housed them, that the buildings actually set a stage for appropriate governance. And so hold that thought. That's our first vignette. Our second vignette unfolds here in the United States. Along the Potomac River, just south of the national capital of Washington, D.C., stands the house, which you can see in a mid-19th century photograph on the top right. The house is called Mount Vernon. And Mount Vernon was the home of George Washington, the first president of the United States. By 1850, Mount Vernon had been a place of tourist destination from before George Washington's death. And even in his older years, hundreds and hundreds of visitors were coming to Mount Vernon, both to meet the president in his older years, but also to understand and to see Mount Vernon as a historic landmark. And so even from the 18th century, Mount Vernon was a tourist destination and a representation of sort of an embodiment of the ideals represented by George Washington. By 1850, that magnificent building, the private residence of George Washington, had really fallen into remarkable disrepair. The reality of that disrepair bore heavily on leading women, both in the North and the South. And this was particularly true, and by that I mean the North of the United States and the South of the United States. This is particularly true by the 1850s, because the 1850s is one of the United States' most contentious decades. There are heated debates that are emerging in the 1850s around the morality and the legality of the institution of slavery. And this means that in the 1850s, the United States is absolutely beginning to fracture into two separate views. And those two separate views really fell along the geographic lines of Northerners versus Southerners. A group of women led by Anne Cunningham, who you see on the left, in 1853 sought to use historic preservation as a means of forging or reuniting these two sides. And Cunningham was famous for arguing that if the men of this country have seen fit to allow the home of its most respected hero to go to ruin, then why can't the women of America band together and save it? And it's important for us to recognize that this was absolutely a women's movement in the 1850s. As men were hotly debating the institution of slavery, women were stepping up and trying to do the work of reuniting the United States in this most sectional political debate of the 1850s. So with that second vignette in hand, the first in England, the second here in the United States, our third vignette takes us to Beijing, China. Very recently, Beijing, well, until very recently, Beijing was characterized by hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres of Seihuan, which you can see in the aerial view, the black and white aerial view in the middle of the screen. Seihuan are more commonly referred to as courtyard houses. And I've put a floor plan of one of these courtyard houses on the right-hand side. They follow a fairly typical model. You'll have the main entrance typically to the south that'll enter into a welcome courtyard. And then visitors that are invited to come more fully into the house can pass around that sort of central pavilion into the heart, which you see is a big courtyard space called number 9 that has flanking buildings and rooms on either side. This very particular formula characterizes domestic architecture in the city of Beijing and in many other Chinese cities for centuries. This is a long-standing practice, and it reflects both religious views. Usually, these courtyard houses have very few openings to the northwest, because it is believed in traditional Chinese culture that evil forces and evil winds assault the domicile, the house, from the northwest. And so there are very few openings, neither windows nor doors to the northwest. Entrance is usually to the south. They also reflect the reality of extended families living together, multiple generations, all collectively living in here. And there's the spaces have a very distinctive hierarchy. There are rooms with greater honor, and there are rooms with lesser honor. And one's ranking within the family is reflected by one's chamber or one's residence in this space. These courtyard houses were found by the hundreds of thousands in most major cities. But of course, in the last 20 to 30 years, the massive engine of the Chinese economy has meant rapid expansion of these urban centers, especially in Beijing. And I particularly like the photograph that I took last time I was in Beijing that I've got for you here on the screen, which is the front elevation of a fairly large courtyard house immediately adjacent to a fairly recent massive corporate headquarters immediately adjacent to it, big glass and steel building. And so in this moment of the last 20 to 30 years, cities like Beijing are seeing the traditional vernacular architecture quickly eroded as the Chinese economy forges ahead with the construction of and the transformation of major cities as industrial and corporate headquarters. And there has emerged a preservation movement over the last 20 years. And I've got one of those preservationists quote on the screen for you. "You can't let the greedy developers and corrupt officials work hand in hand to destroy our cultural heritage." There is now a preservation movement, a grassroots preservation movement from within Chinese centers to try to preserve these courtyard houses as emblematic of both traditional Chinese culture and some of the features that mean that Chinese culture is different and distinctive from cultures in other countries. Oh, sorry. And so we have these three examples, and I'd like to just dwell on these for just a moment. Why do we preserve buildings? Why do we want to preserve our cultural patrimony? Well, there's numerous reasons, but I'll offer you three that I think are worthy of consideration. The first is that our major public buildings actually serve as stages for national rituals. So if the English example, the example of the House of Commons, teaches us anything, it is that, in fact, Winston Churchill was right, that our buildings shape us as we shape our buildings, that our assumptions about who we are as a body politic or as a community or as a nation is written into, it is inscribed into the buildings that we build. So that when we lose those buildings, we change who we are. We are inextricably tied to the buildings as a result of the rituals and the performances that we engage. The second reason for understanding buildings as cultural patrimony and for preserving them is that our landmarks point to our common story. So Anne Cunningham in the 1850s wanted very badly to preserve Mount Vernon, and she was successful in that preservation, even if she was not successful in stalling the eventuality of the Civil War. But she was successful in preserving Mount Vernon, which is one of America's most visited historic houses to this day. She did so because Anne Cunningham understood that, that George Washington, as our first president, was a person that both Northerners and Southerners could hold fast to. And that if we lost Mount Vernon, we would lose some portion of the national story of our founding through President George Washington. And so preserving landmarks remind us of our common story. And the third reason I think it's important for us to preserve buildings is that our vernacular buildings, like the courtyard houses of Beijing, embody shared belief systems and our habits of everyday life. We as people, no matter where we are, in Santo Domingo or in Virginia, in the United States, no matter where we are, we live our everyday life and we materialize our social, our religious, our political beliefs in our buildings. And so our vernacular buildings, or buildings which are associated with particular places, remind us of everyday life, and the everyday life that we perform in one place is different from the everyday life that we perform in another. For example, there are no courtyard houses in Central Virginia where I live, because nobody lives, or very few people live in Central Virginia according to traditional Chinese belief systems. And so our vernacular buildings tell us who we are by reinforcing the shared beliefs and the shared habits of everyday life that communities embody. So then we now have to ask the question, why do we preserve buildings? Or when do we preserve buildings? And whose stories are we preserving? And these will be the two big questions I will want to sort of emphasize. We'll begin by reflecting a little bit about when right now. And as our lecture unfolds over the course of our time together, we'll start asking the question, whose heritage and whose story? But if you take a look at each of the three different vignettes I've unpacked for you, you'll see that these moments of preservation are each in response to a moment of crisis. And so we often preserve our built environment, we preserve our landmarks when we understand that who we are as a people, as a community, is in crisis, right? In the middle of World War II and the Blitzkrieg of London, that's an incredible moment of crisis. The preservation of a building is an affirmation of who the assemblymen and women in the House of Commons were. In the 1850s, the United States is in the years directly headed up to the Civil War, one of the most fractious moments in our national story, in our national history. And the preservation of Mount Vernon was a strategic and an intentional attempt by women across our country to preserve the Union and to remind us of a common story. But it unfolded in a moment of incredibly heated political tension. And lastly, the preservation of courtyard houses in Beijing. The crisis there is one of economic transformation. As China has exploded over the last decades onto the national stage, and its economy is absolutely a powerhouse, that means the remaking of cities. And that crisis then is, are we just going to become an economic powerhouse? And are we going to lose what it means to be traditional Chinese people? And so the preservation of Chinese courtyard houses is an attempt to preserve what it means to be a Chinese person. So those are numerous reasons why we preserve. I'd like to now shift gears just briefly to talk a little bit about some of the strategies and the history of preservation here in the United States. It is absolutely true. Our cultural attaché was right to suggest that the United States has put a heavy emphasis on historic preservation. That's been true for about 100 years. But it has taken the work of many, both individuals in the private sector, women's organizations, as well as government and international commitments. And so let's take a look at some of those various constituents at play. Most historians of the field of cultural patrimony and historic preservation in the United States understand that Charleston, South Carolina, and you see the aerial view of that city on your screen today, right now. Charleston, South Carolina in the 1920s is where historic preservation really gets its start here in the United States. And so much of that is attributable to Miss Pringle, whose portrait you see here on the left. In the 1920s, Miss Pringle was a preservationist and a suffragette. She was a vibrant and committed activist, both for women's rights, but simultaneously for the preservation of buildings in Charleston. Charleston had been by the legacy of the Civil War, which happens, of course, in the United States in the 1860s. The legacy of the Civil War and the simple fact of the bypassing of industry away from Charleston towards emerging centers like Charlotte and like Atlanta meant that Charleston, which had historically been a powerhouse of a city in the 18th and the 19th centuries, really was finding itself an economic backwater by the early 20th century. So Susan Frost Pringle understood that abandonment by economic investment was actually an opportunity. And today, she was right. Today, Charleston, South Carolina is one of the most visited cities in the United States because it has such an incredibly large percentage of surviving 18th and 19th century buildings. It is the city in the United States that probably has the greatest number of historic buildings still intact in the United States. So how did she do this? She was a dynamic speaker. She was an inspiring convener of people around a cause. And she inaugurated from the beginning conversations on two particular fronts that were incredibly important. The first is that she understood that the historic buildings in Charleston, South Carolina needed to be documented. They needed to be photographed. And so she begins with photographing. She organizes a number of other colleagues. Gilliard Stoney, who would eventually publish the book in the middle, This is Charleston. Gilliard Stoney was an incredibly important sort of author and photographer. And she convenes a community of both women and men to take large format cameras across the city of Charleston and to photograph and to document Charleston's surviving cultural patrimony, the surviving buildings. And they did that. They photographed hundreds and hundreds of buildings over the course of that first 10 years, if for no other reason as a way of documenting, but also communicating the incredible architectural legacy that survived in this city. By publishing this book, the book called This is Charleston, an architectural survey of a unique American city, she made a demonstrated claim that Charleston had more surviving historic buildings and actually could remake itself as a historic city. There is no such thing in the 1920s as a historic city. That concept has not yet really emerged. Well, in the United States, at least. Francesco will remind me that the Italians have been doing that for quite some time. But here in the United States, that was not a category. And she made that claim. So the first tactic that she used was broad documentation via photography. The second was to enlist the Charleston City Council to establish a zoning code. And you see modern representations there of the zoning code on the lower half of your screen. But that zoning code created a policy that governed how buildings could be managed and how they could be preserved, how they could be added to in the city of Charleston. And so it was the establishment of local policy as a governance model over limiting demolition of historic buildings, limiting rapid expansion without approval of historic buildings. And it created a historic zoning policy, which gave some governing authority to the city council, which was then delegated to a board called the Board of Architectural Review. So her first two strategies were documentation and the establishment of a local zoning policy. She then, after she was able to accomplish those, she and the other women who would follow in her stead established three other strategies, which are worthy of consideration. The first, which you see on the left, is the public dissemination of history. They inaugurated a program of signage. And so if and when you have a chance to visit Charleston, South Carolina, you'll walk down the streets and you will see the history of every building, or most buildings, publicly displayed on these panels. She felt that it was important not to just understand these buildings as historic objects, but also as places of family residences. That this would be an opportunity to tell the stories of all the various people that lived in and around the city of Charleston through its many centuries. And so this public dissemination of history on these panels was a third strategy. She also enlisted private property owners, because of course all these buildings are privately owned, private property owners in a competition for best preservation. And so she established, and you'll see this, the disc in the top right, the Karolopoulos Award. But her organization celebrated high quality historic preservation practices by private residences, or by private owners, by awarding a small number of these prizes. And you'll see that this building, which you see on the right, was one of the top recipients in 1969. So throughout the 20th century, preservation attempts by private property owners have been awarded and celebrated, which creates a social incentive amongst property owners to actually preserve their buildings in pursuit of this recognition. And the third strategy was a very sort of interesting tax strategy that she established, she and her followers would eventually establish, and those are preservation easements. She founded an organization that was a private nonprofit, and through preservation easements, a private property owner would give over the right to change the outside of their house, or in some instances to change the inside of their house, would turn over the right of that right over to this organization, which means the organization would then own just the outside of the house, which would reduce the value of the house, which would then diminish their property taxes. And so it was a means by which individuals could be incentivized to work to preserve the outside of their house, but to actually gain some financial benefit as a result of that activity. And so Miss Frost was an incredibly strategic thinker. She was an organizer, and she engaged in a series, these 5 different strategies over the course of the first couple decades, really establishing a standard for historic preservation at the city level in the United States. Many other cities would follow along these 5 successful strategies, and most historic cities in the United States today have an organization or a nonprofit organization which runs one to all 5 of these various strategies because of the incredibly impactful success that these strategies had on Charleston, South Carolina. So if that story is largely unfolding through the opening decades, well, the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s in Charleston, and these strategies are being established on a local level, it is in 1945, right in the wake of the end of World War II, that the United Nations establishes UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. The establishment of UNESCO recognized the global opportunity to encourage countries around the globe to preserve their landmarks, reminding us that UNESCO understood by 1945 that our buildings tell us who we are, that our buildings tell us who we are. And if we wanted to encourage countries and communities to better understand who they are, one of the best ways to do that is to encourage them and to resource them to engage in historic preservation, to preserve their own cultural landscapes as a way of signaling their identity as a community and their people. UNESCO then, by 1977, established the World Heritage List. And the World Heritage List recognized a number of sites in that year and then continuing to this day, sites that contributed to outstanding universal value. And so the criteria to be listed on the World Heritage List is this criteria of outstanding universal value. The University of Virginia, in partnership with Thomas Jefferson's residence, which is Monticello, made an application to be included on the World Heritage List in 1986, and we were successfully listed, as Francesco has said, as the first university to be listed on the World Heritage List. We were so listed in 1987. You see an aerial view, which you'll see again on the right-hand side there of an aerial view of Thomas Jefferson's academical village. And so if the story of historic preservation emerges in the United States, really in the 1920s in Charleston, South Carolina, it is actually in London, that very same city that had been bombed just 2 years, over the previous 2 years, that UNESCO was established, and UNESCO strategies for building out the World Heritage List has been an important global mechanism for encouraging countries to step up and to nominate and then preserve their most important landmarks. This would be followed on the national stage in 1966 with the signing by President Lyndon Johnson of the Historic Preservation Act. The Historic Preservation Act accomplished 2 important things on the national stage here in the United States for the preservation of historic architecture. The first is that it established the National Register of Historic Places, right? And the National Register of Historic Places would basically be the American predecessor to the World Heritage List. And this is a register, literally a listing of landmarks that have been nominated by various states for consideration for listing on the National Register. And you can see one of the registry plaques there on the top right. So if the first act was the establishment of the National Register, which is a national listing of our most important landmark buildings, the second component of the Historic Preservation Act is equally important, and that is that it established in every single state a historic preservation office, an office of government officials, usually fairly small office, 4 to 5 people, although they've grown more recently, but an office that is charged with the responsibility of supporting and enacting historic preservation strategies in their state. And you can see the Department of Historic Resources map. Virginia is actually divided into 3 different zones. Virginia is my state in the United States where I live. And the state of Virginia is divided into 3 different zones. And there's a cultural preservation and historic preservation strategy for each of those different zones. And the State Historic Preservation Office is charged with the preservation across those 3 different zones. And so what we see in this whole series of, in this particular story, is we see private individuals working together to establish NGOs or nonprofit organizations who take on the responsibility of preserving their localities. We see the United Nations stepping in the mid-century on the global stage to support and ensure and to signal the importance of landmark preservation by countries on the international stage. And in 1966, we see the United States making a commitment to resourcing, providing professional advice for historic preservation distributed across the entire country by state. Now, there were 3 universities that in that particular moment understood, that moment being 1966, understood the importance that historic preservation was going to require a pipeline of professional development. So there were 3 universities that convened a conversation. That would be my university, the University of Virginia, Columbia University, and the University of Pennsylvania. Leading faculty at these 3 institutions at the moment of the passing of the Historic Preservation Act understood that those state historic preservation offices were going to need to be trained. They're going to need to have staff who are professionally trained. And so each university launched a historic preservation department at the graduate level, and each university claimed a domain from within historic preservation. Now, by domain, I mean that the University of Pennsylvania, seen on the top right there, important photograph from the founding of that department, the University of Pennsylvania claimed the space of materials conservation. They wanted to be leaders in the actual physical conservation of buildings. And so there's an emphasis on the sort of chemistry and engineering of historic preservation, has long defined preservation at the University of Pennsylvania. At Columbia University, they focused heavily on policy and on public practices. And we at the University of Virginia emphasized history. And so each of the various graduate students that would be graduating from our programs would have degrees in historic preservation, but with particular emphases, so that historic preservation offices across the country would ideally be equipped with expertise in all 3. And so not only do we see NGOs stepping up to the plate, we see private individuals advocating for historic preservation. We also see the government stepping in and taking responsibility for properly resourcing historic preservation by state. Lastly, we also see universities stepping up and making sure that there is a trained professional pipeline of experts who can actually do that work on the national stage. So if that's the story of historic preservation at the local up to the global stage, how does that play out here at the University of Virginia? What you're seeing on the screen is a print that was produced in 1826 of the University of Virginia, right at the moment of its opening, actually just prior to its opening, and having been selected by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, one of the United States early presidents, is the founder of my university. And he founded the University of Virginia, founded, designed, and built the University of Virginia as the last act of his life. And so we at UVA like to think about the University of Virginia not just as an educational institution, but also as a component of the architecture of democracy that Thomas Jefferson had spent his entire life building. What do I mean by that? Well, Jefferson, of course, is the author of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And from that particular moment, and actually even just briefly before that, but from that particular moment on, he dedicated his life to building up the architecture of democracy. And that is both the legislation around democracy. He contributed to discussions around the Constitution, but also the enactment of democracy, but also its actual buildings. He played a critical role in designing the Capitol building here in Richmond, which is our state's capital. And so the building that you see on the left-hand side, that central core, was designed as the Capitol building for my state, for the state of Virginia. And it's directly informed, sadly, Francesco, not from an Italian building, but in fact, a Roman building in southern France that he had visited, the Maison Carrée, and you see an 18th century painting of the Maison Carrée there on the right. He understood that classical architecture was essential for classical architecture to be the language of democracy. And so as he is thinking about the legislation and the policy and the moral arguments for democracy, he is also aligning those moral arguments for democracy with a physical expression. And that physical expression takes the form of classical architecture, as you can see here. Thomas Jefferson is also the Secretary of State under George Washington, who I've already introduced as the first president. And as the Secretary of State, he plays a critical role in the process of laying out what is now our capital city, the city of Washington, D.C. And so partnering with the designer, Charles L'Enfant, the Secretary of State is the person who is charged with enacting the construction of what would become our federal city. And so he plays a really critical role in realizing through the Capitol building and through the White House, which are the two major monuments that you see on this plan, realizing those buildings. Thomas Jefferson had very clear views on what our Capitol building should look like. And when you were thinking about Thomas Jefferson's Capitol building, you'll have to think just about the little core. You have to take the dome off, and the two massive wings for our bicameral legislature were added quite a bit later. But the bright white core of that building is something that Thomas Jefferson played a really important role in helping to shape. And so he is literally spending his life, his career, building out the architecture of democracy. He also plays a role in training up Robert Mills, who would be the designer of the Treasury building, also here in Washington, D.C., perpetuating this association in the public imagination, in the American public imagination, of the alignment of classical architecture with American democracy. And Thomas Jefferson played the critical role in tying those two things together, that our practices of American democracy were visualized, were realized in the language of classical architecture, columns. And you can see here with these on the Treasury building. So that when he turns at the very end of his life to designing a new university, he's not actually pivoting from politics to education, because he strongly believed that the best defense against a corrupt government was an educated populace. And so his commitment to building out a new university was very specifically to train up intellectual political leaders for the new nation. And so we at UVA believe that Thomas Jefferson built out the University of Virginia, not just as a university, but actually as an incredibly important keystone in his project of the architecture of democracy. In 1818, Jefferson would argue that the university's purpose was to form statesmen, legislators, and judges on whom public prosperity and individual happiness so much depend. And so it's very clear in his own words that a proper liberal classical education was essential for the leaders of this new democracy. He organized all what he referred to as useful knowledge into these 9, sometimes 10 different categories: modern languages, ancient languages, botany and zoology, and in a revolutionary model, completely transformed the way young men would be educated at this university. Each pavilion, and you can see the pavilions are the buildings on the east and the west sides here. There's 5 pavilions on each side for a total of 10. And the whole of what we refer to as the academical village has as a capstone building, the round building, the rotunda building at the left, was the library, was the kind of core administrative library for Thomas Jefferson's complex. So these 10 pavilions were each to house one of those professors, and each professor was to be the master over his school. And so a student would come to the university and would enroll in a variety of different schools. And one of the things that Jefferson felt so strongly about was that students themselves would be in charge of their own education. And so they would sit at the feet of masters in the particular schools, each of those schools housed in its own individual building. This is the very first of the pavilions that was built by Thomas Jefferson. And I show it to you just to help you see that it's a two-story building. Jefferson intended each of the pavilions to have as the upper story the residence of the professor, which would include a couple different rooms, a study and a dining room and a bedchamber upstairs for the professor. And the lower floor was intended to be the classroom space, so that when class was in session, the students who are in residence in those small buildings on either side, there's these hyphens that connect each of the pavilions. The students live in small rooms, almost like monastic alcoves that are in these hyphens between the various pavilions. The students would leave their rooms and move horizontally into the classroom space. The professor would descend the stairs into that same classroom space, and they would meet for the purposes of education. Thomas Jefferson designed every single one of these pavilions. Each of the 10 were a result of his own hand. So not only was he a political theorist in his work of authoring the Declaration of Independence, he was also one of early America's most important architects. And this is the drawing. All 10 of these drawings survive in our special collections here at the university. This is the drawing for the building that I just showed you, Pavilion. This is Pavilion 7. There's the elevation on the top left and the floor plans for that building. This is a revolutionary departure from the inherited tradition, at least the inherited Western tradition, of education. Most students prior to the University of Virginia would have been educated at places like whose architecture had been shaped by the traditions established by Oxford and Cambridge. And you see an aerial view here of Oxford University, of course, outside in Oxford, England. The organizational model for all education prior to this had largely been the quadrangle. And you can see that scattered around Oxford University are a whole series of these quadrangles, these courtyards, each quadrangle reflecting one college, and including both the residences as well as the classroom spaces of both faculty and students. Jefferson felt that this hodgepodge mashed together arrangement did not follow Enlightenment logic well enough. And so in his redesign of a new form, an entirely new form for a university, he built out the University of Virginia as these independent buildings, one small pavilion intended to house each of the various domains of knowledge, so that one pavilion would be the place where a student would learn about zoology and botany, for example. Much more logical, much more a highly structured organization for the designing out of the university. Jefferson also had spent quite a bit of time in Paris in the 1780s. He was the ambassador to France for the new government, for the new United States government. And while he's in Paris, there is a raging debate amongst public health officials and architects in Paris and in England as well around the design of hospitals. And most hospitals prior to the late 18th century had been single massive buildings. And there was a move in this late 18th century period to move towards a pavilion model for hospitals, where every type of disease would be segregated away from other diseases in its own pavilion. And so this is a move in the late 18th century towards what we would eventually call wards, or various wards of modern hospitals organize their spaces according to the types of care that are necessary. And so Jefferson is, in his redesign of the University of Virginia, is also drawing on this current debate that is unfolding in 1780s Paris and in London. You'll also see that each of the pavilions, and you've got that aerial view in the top left again, but each of the pavilions, and I've shown you 3, are different from one another. This is a radical departure from the Renaissance or classical tradition within which Jefferson is operating. Most classical architecture in this period, up to this period, would have absolutely demanded that everything that's on the left-hand side of a design would be mirrored perfectly by details on the right-hand side. Jefferson was revolutionary enough to depart, to break that rule by designing each of the pavilions as its own distinct structure. So no one pavilion is the same as any other pavilion. Why did he do that? Well, he realized that most Americans are coming from landscapes that have not yet trained them in classical architecture. And he wanted to use the buildings of the University of Virginia itself as pedagogy. He wanted to use the buildings as a teaching tool. And you can see here that he would argue that he wanted the buildings to reflect the purest forms of antiquity, furnishing to the student examples of the precepts he will be taught in that particular art. So each of the buildings is actually designed as a way of educating the students in the fundamentals of classical architecture. Why? Because Jefferson believes that there's a direct connection between American democracy and the classical tradition, the classical architectural tradition. So if Americans are going to truly do the work of supporting American democracy, they needed to do so understanding the millennial-long tradition upon which, at least in Jefferson's mind, that democracy stood. And so here you see that view, the view that had been established by Thomas Jefferson right at the opening of the university, the larger print, and the aerial view. And I hope at this point you can see the basic structural organization of the core of the university where I teach, the University of Virginia. Well, so the story that I've just unfolded for you is a story that we have long told here at the University of Virginia, but it's a story that's come under increasing challenge. The University of Virginia did not admit women or people of color in any substantial numbers until the early 1970s. So from Thomas Jefferson's founding, for more than 150 years thereafter, the University of Virginia was a university dedicated to training almost exclusively white men. By the 1970s, this, of course, had come under very direct critique. By the later 1970s and by the early 1980s, as larger and larger numbers of African-American students successfully enrolled and successfully graduated from the University of Virginia, there was a growing critique that the University of Virginia had very few African-Americans on its faculty. And so race plays an incredibly important role in understanding the cultural patrimony and our interpretation of the architecture of the University of Virginia, really since the 1970s through to the present. And this has meant that over the last 10 years or so, the University of Virginia has come up with new strategies for interpreting the same landscape that I've just unpacked for you. And so rather than showing us the 1826 view, which privileges Jefferson's perspective on the University of Virginia, this is an 1850 plat of the University of Virginia. And that means this is an aerial representation of the land. And I hope that you can see that right here in this longitudinal rectangle, that is the lawn that I was showing you before. There's 5 pavilions on either side. The rotunda is the capstone building at either end. That's the educational core. But when we look at it in this 1850s plat, a plat that reflects the University of Virginia 25 years after it was opened, we can see that there's a functioning landscape. There's a working landscape all around the University of Virginia. And if we zoom in, you can see that there's this section here. It says the 10 professors' grass lots containing each 4 acres. And then down here below, the 10 professors' gardens, each 1 acre. Why on earth would each professor need a 1-acre garden or a 4-acre grass lot? Well, in 1850, each professor needs those because each professor owns a community of enslaved African Americans who are actually producing all of the meals that that professor would eat. They have cows, they have horses. And so the grass lots are pasturage for livestock, segregated by pavilion. And the 10 professors' gardens are kitchen gardens, the gardens which will actually provide the fruits and vegetables that would supplement the meals of each of the professors. So I'm going to confess to you now that I've lied to you. I told you that each of the pavilions were 2 stories. And when you're standing in the middle of the lawn and you're looking here at Pavilion 4, you can see that they do appear to be 2 stories. As Jefferson designed them for our view, he wanted us to believe that each of these buildings was 2 stories, the professor's apartment above and the classroom, the professor's classroom below. But when we turn to documentary evidence from this same period, a different story emerges. So Pavilion 4, which I just showed you, the very first professor in Pavilion 4 was a German-born and German-trained modern languages professor named George Bladerman. And if you look at the very bottom register here, you'll see George Bladerman's name written in this 1830 census. If you scan to the middle, you'll see this dash mark is Professor Bladerman himself. Over on the far right-hand side, you'll see a second dash, and that's under the females section. This is Professor Bladerman's wife. And then on the far left, the number 2 and the single slash are Professor Bladerman's 3 young boys. He has 3 boys under the age of 15. So if we look at this particular census, we can interpret a story of a family of 5, a father and a mother and 3 young boys under the age of 15. Until we turn the page on that very same census. When we turn the page on that same census, and I'll do the math for you, we can add 5 plus 3 is 8. 8 plus 3 is 13, plus 4 is 15, excuse me, plus 3 more is 18. The 1830 census doesn't tell us a story of a white family of 5, but in fact, a white family of 5 and an enslaved population of 18. And you'll see at the far right-hand side, the number 23, that is the adding together of the enslaved population of 18 people plus the white population of 5 people. There are not 5 people living in that building. There are 23 people living in that building in 1830. 23 people. Where on earth are they? Well, the reality is that Thomas Jefferson designed the academical village and the 10 pavilions on a ridgeline. And he built not 2-story buildings, but he built 3-story buildings on either side of the ridgeline. And then used the flattening down of the topography as a way of burying that the lowest floor, as it faces the academical lawn, so that the landscape of education is understood to be 2-story buildings, and that's the landscape that's dominated largely by white people. But when you go down the hill on either side of that ridgeline, and you look back, as this photograph does on the left, you can see that each of the pavilions is in fact not 2 stories, but 3 stories. What Jefferson has done is he has very strategically used the change in topography as a way of hiding this lowest story of the building. And that's where those 18 people are living. I have for you on the screen a photograph of Lucy Cottrell. Lucy Cottrell is, we only have Lucy Cottrell's photograph because she is holding Charlotte Bladerman. You'll remember the story that there were 3 young sons, all under 15. One of those sons grows up, marries, and has the first grandchild is Charlotte Bladerman. So the reason we have a photograph of Lucy Cottrell, who is the enslaved maidservant for the family, is because she's holding George Bladerman's first granddaughter, Charlotte. I show you this photograph because of the many hundreds of enslaved people that lived and worked at the University of Virginia. She is one of the only 3 for whom we have a surviving photograph. So while we have long told the story, certainly of Thomas Jefferson, we have told the story of the professors, and we have told the story of the students, only recently is the University of Virginia started to tell the story of the enslaved population that was absolutely essential for the running of the University of Virginia. So if we take a look at this same 1830s census distributed, you can see that we have a better understanding for the spatial distribution of both enslaved and free people, free white people and enslaved Black people who live and work in this space. And we estimate that there's about 150 enslaved people living and working at the University of Virginia at any one point in time through its first half century. So we've built a digital model that will help us better understand how topography works. And you can see here in the top left, a digital model that cuts through as a section of one of those pavilions, showing the 2 floors that look towards the academical village to the right, but then the lower story, the buried floor, which looks to the work yards back to the left. Those work yards are today filled with tulips and azaleas. They're beautiful, luxurious gardens, but we have to remember that those, in fact, that's not how they functioned in the first 50 years of their occupation. This 1850 plat shows us a whole series of small buildings that littered through those gardens. Those gardens were filled with chicken coops and pigsties and small kitchen gardens. This is where pigs would be slaughtered and drained and smoked. This is where laundry is being cleaned. All of the work that was necessary to support the everyday lives of the professors, they all unfolded in these gardens. Those gardens and those stories have now been erased as the University of Virginia has, over the last 50 years, had these beautiful gardens installed in their place. You don't see pigsties, you don't see chicken coops, but you see dogwoods and azaleas and tulips. This is an aerial view of the digital model that we've been building over the last few years. This digital model is both a visual representation of the University of Virginia, but it's also an important analytical tool because it allows us to erase all of the later changes. So everything that has been added to the University of Virginia after 1850 has in this digital model been removed. That allows us to better re-visualize how the University of Virginia looked and functioned. As we have undertaken archaeology around our grounds, it allows us to reconstitute things like fence lines and privies and other buildings that were so essential to this 19th century landscape, all of which is now lost. We can reconstruct that, not in reality, but in this digital world. And so this digital model is an ongoing strategy for us as we're constantly learning more from early photographs, from written descriptions, and from the archaeological record, or allow us to constantly and slowly reconstitute this work. I'm showing you this one kitchen behind one of the pavilions. This is a kitchen that we have now rebuilt in the digital model, but it's an important kitchen because it's the kitchen that was overseen by Isabella Gibbons. And you see the photograph, a post-Civil War photograph of Isabella Gibbons in the top left. Isabella Gibbons was the cook, the principal cook for this pavilion. And so she's overseeing all of the work and the delivery of 3 meals a day. She's also an incredibly smart person who taught herself both how to read and to write. And she engaged in the practice of listening in on many of the lectures that were being given by the professors. And so at the moment of the end of the Civil War and the emancipation of African Americans, Isabella Gibbons becomes one of the lead educators in the Black school in Charlottesville, because she's one of the most well-educated Black women in our community at that moment, because she has availed herself of the very education that she was never intended to earn. Isabella Gibbons' story and the story of all of these other enslaved people have now been inscribed in the landscape at the University of Virginia. We've recently unveiled this new memorial to enslaved laborers, and I'll end my talk with just a brief introduction to the memorial to enslaved laborers that you see here. This memorial to enslaved laborers is a sleek, modern granite design. Those strategies are very intentional because the architecture of classicism that Jefferson intended to associate specifically with democracy is also associated almost exclusively with white men. And so the materiality, the granite, the use of granite, the hyper-modern design is all an intentional choice to disrupt the inherited tradition of that cultural legacy as a way of saying that there's an additional story, there's a new story that has not been told by our inherited cultural patrimony that we now need to write into the landscape. And by writing this into the landscape in a modern expression, it reminds us that the story of slavery has largely been untold. It was not something that was intended to be seen. It was not a truth that was intended to be rendered. The use of granite, and you can see here the quarry from which that granite came, is very intentional because granite also is not a material that we use much at the University of Virginia. And so rendering it in granite, you can see this aerial view of the new memorial recently opened. The use of the granite was also an intended strategy to introduce a new story. The reason we have a memorial to enslaved laborers relies entirely on those African-American students that I was talking about from the 1970s before. The University of Virginia itself did not have the gumption to step forward and really inaugurate a conversation around our own history of enslavement. It took our Black students, advocating for more robust truth-telling for the University of Virginia to add this new layer, this new and important layer to the cultural patrimony that we have inserted. And that process was, once the University of Virginia listened to those Black students and agreed that we needed to, with integrity, tell the truth about slavery at our own location. With that, we engaged in a broad community engagement process around what this memorial should look like. We expanded our research into how slavery functions. One of the reasons I'm able to give this lecture is because for the last 10 years, the University of Virginia has invested significant resources to better understanding how slavery functioned here at this location. We are, in fact, a research university. It's important that we direct that research towards our own history, even if that history is not flattering, which, of course, the landscape of slavery is certainly not. It has also meant that we've built new relationships. These two women, Datisa Gathers on the left and Colleen Yates on the right, are both descendants that still live in our community, but they're descendants of that enslaved community, direct descendants from the slaves that the University of Virginia used to own. And so the University of Virginia is now doing the work of building relationships with that descendant community in an attempt to honor their legacy, to hear their stories, and to make sure that they actually feel incorporated, that they feel included into the cultural patrimony that is the landscape of the University of Virginia. The memorial has an inner wall that, much like the Vietnam Memorial here in Washington, D.C., is simply a wall of names. All of the names that we've been able to uncover so far have been inscribed on that wall. We have ongoing research that means that every single name that surfaces in the written record will now be inscribed on that wall. And we have an annual inscription day, one day when the descendants of that particular person can come and see the name of their ancestor inscribed on the wall. And so it's a living monument and a living memorial. And you can see a detail here. It's actually a beautiful thing when it rains. It's almost looks as if the names and the little gash marks weep for that history. And so the memorial to enslaved laborers is an incredibly important addition. Lastly, it also tells the story through a timeline. And so the University of Virginia did the hard work of owning our history of violence through the institution of slavery and incorporated that into the memorial. The memorial ends with this powerful quote from Isabella Gibbons. She's that cook that I introduced a few minutes ago. She writes a letter that becomes a foundation for a history lecture for her students. She authors this in 1867, which is 2 years after her emancipation. She's been a free woman only 2 years. And she writes this: "Can we forget the crack of the whip, the cowhide, the whipping post, the auction block, the handcuffs, the spaniels, the iron collar, the Negro trader tearing the young child from its mother's breast as a whelp from the lioness? Have we forgotten that by those horrible cruelties, hundreds of our race have been killed? No, we have not, nor ever will." Well, the reality is that the University of Virginia, by telling a story that centered only Thomas Jefferson, meant that we did forget. We actually chose to tell one story and not a broader story. And so Isabella Gibbons' quote is the concluding quote of the memorial. And it's a little hard to see, but her eyes are actually inscribed on the outside of the memorial in an artful display, which reminds us that Isabella Gibbons and her story and her descendants are forever watching the University of Virginia. She is now inscribed in our landscape and is now included as part of our cultural patrimony. So that the cultural patrimony of the University of Virginia speaks not just to the white men it was intended to honor initially and to educate initially, but now includes a much more inclusive representation of all the people that once occupied this particular landscape. And so with that, I will conclude by saying that cultural patrimony at UVA has been incredibly important. We have participated in the graduation of students in our historic preservation department for 50 years, helping to shape the professional environment across the United States. But we also have done the hard work of self-assessment to understand the legacy and the history that we ourselves have inherited, and how do we responsibly tell that story so that everyone who lives in Charlottesville and at the University of Virginia feels that this landscape is in fact their cultural patrimony. Thank you very much.
Gracias, profesor Nelson. Ha sido una conferencia extremadamente interesante. He aprendido mucho de la historia y del patrimonio de los Estados Unidos. Gracias por su tiempo. Ahora vamos a pasar a la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Entonces, tenemos aquí varias preguntas que se han ido registrando en la cajita de conversación, y Carlos Pion desde Atomayor del Rey y Stephanie Ogando hicieron más o menos la misma pregunta sobre las conexiones que existen entre la arquitectura y la historia de la humanidad. ¿Cuáles son esas conexiones?
Well, that's really a fundamental question, and that's the question that I've basically rafted my entire life and career on. So I'm happy to try to grapple with that question. Let me say that many people who understand themselves as architectural historians, and I am professionally trained as an architectural historian, many people who are architectural historians interpret buildings through the lens of their makers, which means that they write books and they give lectures on the history of architects. I am much less interested in telling the story of the history of architects and their particular architectural production. I'm much more interested in telling the story of the people who lived and occupied buildings. And so my particular methodology, which is why I'm so interested in the courtyard houses in Beijing, for example, I'm very interested in the ways that we can interpret the human experience and the values and the practices and the structures of communities through the buildings. And so in many ways, one could argue that I believe that buildings are some of the most important evidence of any people's history. And by saying that, I mean not just the leaders of a nation, but I actually mean the people themselves.
Muchísimas gracias, profesor Nelson. La siguiente pregunta viene de Gidel Ramírez, quien es arquitecto y escritor. En resumidas cuentas, él pregunta, en lo inmediato, ¿qué esfuerzos se podrían realizar para preservar edificios emblemáticos en el país?
I'm sorry, could you ask that question again?
Sure. Basically, I'll make it in English. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Like in immediate, you know, as a what we can do right now, what efforts we can do immediately that could, what efforts we can do to start preserving monuments in our country, or emblematic buildings, historical buildings.
I think that one of the very first steps is always to document. And so I think we can take our lead from Susan Pringle Frost in the 1920s in Charleston, South Carolina, and enact a committed effort to document through photography the kinds of buildings or the landmark building, the singular landmark buildings that are most important to any community. By taking high quality photographs, those photographs can be used as a way of arguing with local elected officials and maybe even national officials for a commitment of some financial resources to preserve those buildings. And so the first step for me is always documentation, because to document is the first act of interest. The second would be, what are the why? The second reason would be, the second act would be to try to understand, why is this building, or is this building type, so important to us? So begin to figure out the narrative of value. And then the last one is very, very practical. And that is, make sure that the roof is watertight, right? So physical documentation is always important. Understanding the history and the stories that are associated with that particular building type is secondly important. But thirdly is knock on the door of your local school of architecture and figure out, how on earth can we make sure that the roof is watertight? Because having a tight roof is one of the best, first and most important steps you can make towards preserving any building.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And the next question actually relates to what you were talking about, like documenting, the importance of documenting. And Stephanie Ogando Lizardo actually asked if architectural photography is considered a form of preservation.
Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. I would say, so architectural documentation through photography is an act of preservation in two ways. One, it actually can be used in advocacy, right? As I was saying before, it's sometimes much easier to take a high quality photograph to a local official and argue for that building than trying to get that local official to take time out of their day to come see the building, right? And so if the officials or if folks won't come see your building, then take your building to the folks. And photography is one of the best ways to do that. It's also important, however, to have photography as an important part of documentation, because you're capturing that building in a particular moment. If you're successful in restoring the building or preserving the building for later generations, they're never going to see the building as you're seeing it in the moment when you take that photograph. And so that photograph also becomes a historic record of a moment in that building's life, right? All buildings have generations of history written into them. When we stabilize or preserve a building, we often try to reduce it to one moment, but that's never really true, right? Buildings have lives. They live, they breathe, they need love and care and attention, just like bodies do. And so architectural photography is incredibly important because it also creates a record of that building in a particular moment in time. And if you do that, please date your photographs. Flip it over after it's printed and write the date on the back, right? That's so incredibly important.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. We have another question from Dale, one of the participants, and he asked if you have any knowledge of historical buildings in the United States that haven't been rescued, reconstructed or restored.
Sure, there's millions of them. One of the things, thank you for the question, Del. One of the things that I regularly strive to do is to bring attention to the very buildings that you're talking about. The American population tends to value things like our Capitol buildings, our courthouses, our monumental churches. And so what we refer to as our landmark buildings in the United States tend to get more attention than do the vernacular buildings that I was talking about at the beginning. And so I spend a lot of my time working with communities, trying to help them both appreciate and then preserve examples of the vernacular buildings in their place. And the advantage is that communities tend to feel very strongly about their local vernacular building types because it tells their story very specifically. But a disadvantage is that those vernacular building types tend not to be of interest to anybody outside of the community. So it's very difficult to raise national funds or to generate interest on the national or even sometimes on the statewide stage. It really has to be the community that does the work of preserving those kinds of buildings. So yes, there are many, many buildings out there that need to be preserved. Just as an aside, I did 10 years of field work in Jamaica, your neighbor, on the north coast of Jamaica, and spent a great deal of my time bringing American students down to Jamaica and living in the north coast for 6 weeks, doing exactly that, taking photographs, preserving and working with local Jamaican carpenters and Jamaican stonemasons to preserve and restore those buildings. So it's very hard work.
Excellent. We have a question from Stephanie Ogando Lizardo, and she asked, how can ancient architecture coexist with what is currently needed from a functional perspective of spaces?
That's a really great question. It's so incredibly important. So the academical village, the 10 pavilions that I've talked about over the course of this lecture, they are still the residences of deans and senior administrators at the University of Virginia. Those deans need flushing toilets. They need working kitchens. They need a high-speed internet, right? So those buildings are not preserved in their early 19th century mode. They've been updated. And so all preservation, anybody who works at a School of Architecture, Francesca will know this, all preservation is always a balance between determining what of value from the building's original or its early periods do we absolutely need to preserve, and then how do we adapt this building so that it will continue to be valuable. Because one thing that we in the United States have absolutely learned is that the best way to preserve a building is to move it back into occupation and use. Because then there's a community of people who are living and working in that building who themselves will care about stabilizing and preserving that building. And so we often think of, in the United States especially, of building preservation as sort of putting a building on ice, right? That it becomes a precious object that nobody can use. But that's actually much more expensive strategy for historic preservation than to do the hard work of finding a way to preserve its historic qualities while simultaneously moving it back into use by the community.
Excellent. The next question is from Teresa Lopez, and her question, it's kind of similar to Stephanie one's, but she asked, like, how can we engage or become closer to our population? How can we bring closer strategies to, common people, strategies of preservation to, common people that could be normalized in daily life, that guarantee that preservation work that it's done, that it's like tangible in a daily life, you know?
Yeah. No,
that's preservation practices can be transferred
right.
for our daily lives.
Yeah, that's a really, really important question, because some of the most effective advocates for historic preservation we have are the people that actually live in those buildings, right? And so this is an incredibly important question. I would argue that one of the best strategies, well, let me say this. Many people who live in communities who have their eyes set only on their sort of personal benefit really want to always move towards what we refer to as a more modern building, right? So they want, if buildings signal who we are, then having a modern building identifies me as a modern person. One of the strategies that we can use is helping people understand that there is value in being a member of a community, right? And so shifting the focus from the individual to the collective or to the community is an important strategy. And one of the ways that we've done this, that I've seen this happen successfully, is through the practice of oral history. Now, oral history has lots of different uses, but one of the most effective ways that I've seen this used is to have university students move into or to partner with a community and then sit down and record the stories of that community's eldest generation. Have the oldest people in that community start telling you their stories, capturing those on audio tape, and then transcribing them as a record. And then afterwards, you can read through all of those and look for evidence of buildings and spaces, right? And how do the oldest people in this community, what are the spaces that they have valued? What are the associations or the practices or the ritual practices that have long marked spaces? And then come back the next summer and tell those particular stories around space so that you can take the words of the community, the eldest residents of the community, and actually use those words as a way of telling the story about why everyday buildings matter to the oldest generation in this community, which what we might think today, certainly in America, there's an assumption that the youngest generation doesn't care at all what the oldest generation thinks. But I would argue if you take that on at the neighborhood level or on the community level, you'll actually see a different effect, that school children really, really are interested in the stories of the eldest generation. And so I would use oral history and listening to the community as a first step strategy there.
Excellent. Francesco wants to intervene and he wants to make some comments. Francesco, you can open your mic.
Sí, gracias. Quiero ayudar también a Irene con una parte de las preguntas para que Luis no responda solamente a preguntas, sino podamos interactuar. No sé si te parece, Luis. ¿Qué tú opinas? Y entonces, en este sentido, hay una pregunta, algo que me pareció muy interesante, que para nosotros como arquitectos a veces es algo que nos permite de anticipar una visión que quizás la gente que no tiene una expertise en este sentido todavía no la capta. Y es lo siguiente. Una pregunta del público es, ¿cómo puede convivir la arquitectura antigua con lo que se necesita actualmente desde una perspectiva funcional de los espacios, ¿no? Y yo no sé, Nelson, si tú estás de acuerdo, pero Luis, mejor dicho, pero nosotros tenemos muchísimos casos de ejemplos de edificios que han tenido un uso en el pasado específico que hoy en día, pero al cambiarlo internamente, por ejemplo, si no tiene un valor particular, se han mantenido lo que podían ser la parte de la caja, como caja, y se han cambiado la destinación de uso. Yo pienso, por ejemplo, en un viaje que hice en Argentina, los diques que están en Buenos Aires, por ejemplo, que aquí se construyen muchísimos casos, malls, edificios, espacios comerciales nuevos, pero se pueden tranquilamente, en algunos casos, hay ejemplos de arquitectura industrial en Madrid, en Buenos Aires, en Italia, donde sea, de edificios que se pueden adaptar para el uso que nosotros queramos darle hoy en día. Eso nos permitiría también de recuperar una parte del patrimonio construido y no necesariamente seguir con una arquitectura extensiva, trabajando, gastando territorio y por ende una serie de operaciones que quizá hoy en día aún más van en contra de lo que podríamos considerar arquitectura sostenible. No sé qué opina en este sentido, Luis.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'd answer that in a couple different ways. It's a very complicated question. I'd answer it in a couple different ways with different ways for us to be thinking about that. I tend to think, because I really like the phrase cultural patrimony, but because I tend to think of the historic built environment as an extension of the community itself, my highest priority is always community health, right? So historic buildings as part of community health. In light of that, there are a couple different conditions that we have to consider when we're thinking about community health. One is economics. What I would advise for the preservation of a building in a community that has a significantly healthy economic context might be different from what I would advise a community that has that's a disenfranchised community context, or that have a disenfranchised economic domain. So when I was doing work in Jamaica, I was engaging with a number of communities that have almost no money, right? They have very, very little money. And so the question there for me was, how do we help the community see the value of this historic building and fold it back into use and operation? And my standards for my standards are going to be much lower there for insisting on a certain kind of preservation criteria. Whereas if I were to go to, let's say, somewhere in a small town in Italy that will have more sort of financial wealth, then my standards are going to be higher because community health there can afford the expense of more careful preservation of the interior as well as the exterior of the building. And so I absolutely take your point that sometimes finding a new use, a different use for a building, preserves some of the architectural fabric, but can actually dramatically impact or negatively impact the interior of the building. And it also puts the building on a new course. And so in some instances, and again, this is all sort of situational for me. I think context, the architectural context always matters. And this is, if I'm dealing with a building that is unique, then different from everything else in its place, then I'm going to want to have a higher bar for preserving its integrity and its use. But if I'm dealing with a building that has some historic integrity, but there are hundreds of buildings in that place like this building, then my bar will be a little bit lower, right? Trying just to insist that that building get back into use. So my answer really is, it's a complicated question, it's a complicated answer, and that is context really matters a lot. And context for me is really hovered around availability of resources and economic wealth of that community, but then also just my general assessment of community wealth. But let me also say, you made an important point about architects. And I think architects always play a really important role in this space because architects are trained to imagine a future, as you were saying at the beginning, that most people don't have that kind of training. Now, I'm not trained as an architect, I'm trained as an historian, but I work in a school of architecture, and so I'm around visionaries like yourself all the time, right? And I think it's important for communities to listen to architects to help, because architects have the capacity to envision a future that often the community can't envision for themselves. But there has to be a balance because the architect, a successful preservation projects always centers the values of the community and not necessarily the values of the architect, right? And so what I'm wanting to do is to have the architect understand themselves as someone who can explode the imagination of the community, but not to get too far out ahead of the community so that the community ends up with a building that they're never going to use, right? And so there always has to be this balance between the community values.
O que no sienten suyos, que no sienten como edificios que necesitan, porque efectivamente la relación, ¿no?, entre comunidad y arquitectos tiene que ser de un lado hacia el otro y al revés. Porque si no se tendría esta visión en la cual el arquitecto está arriba, la sociedad está abajo, entonces le vamos a construir lo que nunca ellos necesitaban, van a utilizar. Siguiendo en este rumbo.
That's exactly right. Those kinds of buildings are more about the architect than they are about the community they're working in. And that hubris really, that's just that, how do I say this? I don't want to say shameful, but I really want to say shameful, right? There's something about, architects understanding that they're serving a community and that building buildings that says more about the architect leaving an imprint on that community is, that's just not a practice that I can affirm, right? I think that architects they bring incredibly important skills to the table, always very important. But I think that architects should be in service to the communities they're working in and be listening to those communities.
Irene, a ti.
Gracias. So we have the last question. We're running out of time. Thank you, everybody, for your time and your connection. We'll be, before I ask the last question to Professor Nelson, I just want to let you know that we'll be pasting in the chat box a link to a form, an evaluation form that we would appreciate that you please complete it and let us hear from you and hear your feedback. We are very interested in learning what you thought about this experience, this virtual conference. And the next question is actually like a multiple question, Professor Nelson. It says, Odile Estrella mentions regarding governance, what do you recommend we do to help us reconcile the restoration of historic buildings in the Dominican Republic, first with the dilemma of private ownership of property, as well as lack of representation, and second, enforcement of city planning level for better protection of historic registry of buildings in our government?
Yeah, I think the best way to do that is to take up the language of stewardship. And what I mean by that is private property owners tend to want to think of themselves as owning their building. And in a legal sense, they absolutely do own that building. But if it's a historic building, then the legacy of that building is actually owned by the community, right? And so I try to encourage communities to shift from home ownership to home stewardship, because a steward of a building understands that they're inheriting something that existed before them and that they're passing on something to someone after they're dead, right? And so home ownership tends to generally work under the assumption that I have complete control over this. But stewardship is the language that assumes that there's something bigger to this building than just the building itself and my legal containment of it. And so on the local level, I would encourage organizations and community groups to shift towards the language of stewardship over ownership. And I would also encourage you to work with, I think preservation always happens best at the local level. And so I would encourage community groups to work with your local elected officials, because local elected officials tend to be more accountable than do national organizational officials. Local elected officials, because they live in your community, they have to live with you after they've finished their term. Hold them accountable and ask them to help you insist on the preservation of historic buildings as part of our collective identity, right? And there, again, is that shift away from the individual towards the collective. Affirming collective identity is the most empowering way forward, and to do so as a community.
Excelente, muchísimas gracias, profesor Nelson. De verdad que ha sido, estas últimas 2 horas han sido muy enriquecedoras para nosotros. Francesco quiere el micrófono por un momento.
Sí.
Tan pronto tú concluyas, Francesco, yo cierro la conferencia.
Sí, decirle antes que todo las gracias a Luis, dar las gracias nuevamente a la Embajada de Estados Unidos, a todos los que han participado en esta reunión de hoy, que ese cuarto viaje que estamos haciendo a través del patrimonio. Hay algunas preguntas que me permito decir que yo he copiado para poderlas luego enviar a Luis y que él pueda hacernos llegar sus comentarios en este sentido. Y este es una actividad que nos permite también de estrechar lazos con la Universidad de Virginia, por supuesto, con la Escuela de Arquitectura, y que esperamos muy pronto pueda, hasta cierto punto, quiero completar la respuesta de Luis. O sea, esa, por ejemplo, es una estrategia. Las academias se unen para poder ayudar a hacer qué cosa, la recopilación de datos sobre el patrimonio y luego, en una segunda fase, identificar las posibilidades de rescate del mismo patrimonio. Invitamos a Luis en un próximo futuro a visitarnos aquí en San Pedro. Aquí hay muchísimo trabajo que hacer, te lo puedo garantizar. Nos podrá ayudar desde tu experiencia, claro que sí. Y por ahora un abrazo virtual en la espera de podernos ver pronto.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Francesco. De nuevo, muchísimas gracias, profesor Nelson, por aceptar nuestra invitación a ser parte de esta conferencia virtual sobre el patrimonio arquitectónico de los Estados Unidos. Ha sido, vuelvo y repito, sumamente enriquecedor. También agradecemos a todos los participantes que han estado con nosotros durante la conferencia y estamos muy agradecidos por su presencia. La Embajada de los Estados Unidos, de nuevo, agradece al profesor Nelson por haber aceptado nuestra invitación para dictar una conferencia y a la Universidad UCE, a la Universidad Central del Este, por ser nuestro colaborador durante este evento. Nos vemos en la próxima y a todos que tengan un feliz resto del día. Hasta luego. Hasta la próxima.